Welcome everyone. This is our Neighbors, Friends, and Families online learning session titled Understanding the Barriers to Bystander Intervention. My name is Christine Wildman, and my pronouns are they, them, and I'm a research and knowledge mobilization specialist for Neighbors, Friends, and Families. I'm going to start with a bit of housekeeping. So all participants automatically have their mics and cameras off. Live closed captioning is available. To select it, look for the CC button on the meeting toolbar and then click on the CC button to toggle the captions on or off. The chat will be open during the introduction only. We encourage you to engage in a safe and respectful manner. You can also review the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub's safety guidelines, which are posted in the chat. The link to them is there in the chat. And these are the guidelines we will follow for this online learning session. If you'd like to mute chat notifications, click the cap arrow next to the chat button in the Zoom menu bar, then uncheck Show Chat Previews. To maintain a safe and focused space, once the presentation begins, we'll close the chat for the remainder of the session. If you have any questions for the presenters or organizers, you can put them in the Q&A box. There will also be an evaluation link that automatically opens in the browser when the event ends, and a certificate of participation will be generated once you complete the optional evaluation. And that certificate of completion will go to your email, usually within 15 minutes, and if you don't receive it, check your junk mail. I also want to note that this online learning session is being recorded and will be posted on the Neighbors, Friends, and Families website and YouTube page. This session is also will take place in English, but will have simultaneous French interpretation. So you will need to select your preferred audio language. To do this, click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the navigation panel if you're using a desktop. Then select either English or French. To select the language of your slides, you can click the tab that says English slides or diapositive en français on your, sorry, I'm not a French speaker, so I probably butchered that, but it's on your, and then you can choose the option you'd like. So that's all I have for housekeeping, and I'm going to move on now to do a bit of an acknowledgement. So the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, or CREVAC, is situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoak, and Shinaatin nations, who are the original and ongoing inhabitants of this land. These lands are connected to the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, I am located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Adirondack peoples, and we are committed to the development and application of knowledge for the prevention of gender-based violence, and we recognize that Indigenous women, girls, LGBTQIA plus, and Two-Spirit people are subject to disproportionately high rates of violence. And this violence is deeply rooted in Canada's historical and ongoing colonial structures, including the Indian Act, the generational harms and injustices of residential schools, the 60s scoop, birth alerts, breaches of rights, and both historic and ongoing forms of systematic anti-Indigenous racism. Colonial systems such as heterosexuality, binary genders, and patriarchy continue into contemporary systems of oppression and are continually reinforced at all levels of life. These, among other systems of oppression, including racism, ableism, classism, ageism, and other forms of structural violence, are built into the structure of Canada and act to privilege some while disadvantaging and discriminating against Indigenous peoples. So, in doing this work, we acknowledge the historical, present, and future impacts of colonial violence and its intersections with gender-based violence. We acknowledge the resilience of the Indigenous peoples that have and continue to live, love, and resist here. In acknowledging the land, it's also important to connect with the land. And where I'm located, we got some very much needed rain last night. The thunderstorms kept me up for much of the night, but I was extremely grateful for this because it's been very dry. There are many forest fires raging, and water is obviously a very pivotal part of life. I also want to highlight a resource. Neighbors, Friends, and Families has a partner campaign called Kanaway Hitawan, which translate to taking care of each other's spirit. And this campaign is organized by the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers and raises awareness about the signs of abuse and promotes community healing. It's rooted in Indigenous traditional values and encourages everyone to recognize the warning signs of abuse, support safety, and take action. And I will put a link to their campaign in the chat in a few moments. Okay, I'm going to introduce our presenter now. Dr. Alexa Clark is a social psychologist and a research and mobilization specialist at CREVAC. She's an expert on social behavior and how different contexts and situations change the way that people act. In addition to her research expertise, Dr. Clark is also a educator and skilled facilitator. Her projects involve preventing and addressing harassment and violence at work. So welcome, Alexa.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everybody for coming today. I'm very excited to talk to you about understanding the barriers to bystander intervention. So before we get started, I just view of the we will be touching on in today's webinar. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of harassment and violence at work, followed by discussing bystander intervention training, barriers to intervention, and finally, the decision model of helping. So, harassment and violence at work is a pervasive problem in Canada and globally. In a recent national survey conducted by researchers at CREVAC and specifically with the Respect at Work project, they 4% of Canadian workers reported that they had experienced at least one form of harassment and violence or sexual harassment and violence at work in the previous 2 years. And in some sectors, this number is even higher. So, in a recent study of women in the skilled trades, for example, they found that 91% of workers reported experiencing at least one form of sexual and/or gender-based violence while working in the skilled trades. So, this slide and the following slide show a summary of the types of behaviors people reported in the National Survey of Canadian Workers. So the types of harassment and violence behaviors that were experienced by workers in this study included things like verbal and physical intimidation, exclusion from work-related activities, displays of hateful or discriminatory materials, and even physical assault. And in and violence, the types of behaviors that people reported included things like sexual conversation, invasions of personal space, insults, exclusions, and or mistreatment due to the sexual orientation or gender expression, pressure for sexual favors, and even sexual assault. So most workers, as I said, 71.4%, have experienced at least one of these behaviors at work. But even those who have not directly experienced harassment and violence at work are likely to have witnessed at least one incident throughout their career. So, both experiencing and witnessing harassment and violence at work has been linked to many negative impacts, such as burnout, job loss, loss of trust in team members, departments, and employers, absenteeism, and work withdrawal. And even on an institutional level, harassment and violence at work has many negative consequences, including, for example, increased healthcare expenditures and unemployment insurance rates. So, a key factor to mitigating these negative outcomes is early intervention within the continuum of violence. So, the continuum of violence views forms of harassment and violence as interrelated and emphasizes the potential for escalation. So, in other words, harassment and violence rarely starts as overt and extreme. In most cases, it starts as more covert and indirect behaviors like disrespectful comments or jokes that can escalate into more extreme forms like physical assault as time goes on. So, intervening early in the such as when somebody tells a sexist joke, can help lower the risk of escalation so that the most harassment and violence are less likely to occur. And one way of encouraging early and frequent intervention is by encouraging bystander intervention. So, for our purposes, bystander intervention is when somebody who witnesses harassment and violence at work reacts in some way to the incident. So, we'll start by talking about the various ways that behave. So, their behaviors can be categorized in a couple of ways. So, first, bystanders can be active or passive. So, an active bystander might, for example, whereas a passive bystander might empathize with the person experiencing harm, but take no direct action. Behaviors can also be destructive. So, that are constructive can be the person experiencing harm. And destructive can be things like further facilitating the harm being done, um, or just joining in on it, if you will. So, the possibility of these behaviors exists along a matrix and fall into four categories essentially. So, they can be active, constructive, active destructive, or passive destructive. So, most follows the active and focus that fall somewhere within the active constructive quadrant. Bystander training is thought of as an integral part of preventing and addressing harassment and violence at work. And this type of training is great because it focuses on intervening early in the continuum of violence. And it also encourages frequent intervention by peers. So, most often, bystanders are encouraged to intervene directly when the stakes are low. And these low stakes interjections can change people's behavior early in the continuum of violence, which we know that if harassment and violence behavior goes unchecked, it often can escalate. So getting that early intervention is very important. And oftentimes these interjections are done by lateral level coworkers. And that can make the intervention casual and might mean that the perpetrator it feels less defensive and they can adapt their behavior more easily without losing much face in the workplace. So active often follow the 5 Ds of bystander intervention, which stands for distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct. And each action that bystanders can take in response to witnessing an incident of harassment and violence. And the training encourages bystanders to assess the situation and pick an appropriate response. So the decisions about which action to take should be of things like timing, safety, and how to best provide support harm. So before discussing each detail, I want to give an example scenario that I will use throughout to describe the possible responses according to the 5D model of bystander training. So consider the following. You are at work and taking your lunch break in the communal break room. You are sitting at a table having lunch with two of your colleagues, Abby and Oliver. Two of your other coworkers, Alex and Sam, come into the room and sit at the next table. After a few minutes, you hear Alex tell Sam a joke that includes many sexual innuendos. You feel like this joke is not appropriate for the workplace, and you look over to see how Sam is reacting to the joke. Sam looks uncomfortable, and you decide that you need to intervene. So, the first possible intervention tactic, according to the 5D model, is this involves derailing the incident indirectly with the goal of getting the person experiencing,
Alexa,
yeah.
I'm so sorry. Your mic keeps cutting in and out every few
Oh,
words. Could you maybe just try without it and see if we can still hear you okay?
sure. Yeah, just give me 1 minute to adjust the settings.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Maybe just try talking for a bit and we'll see.
Okay. Um, okay. Um, Sorry, where was I? Okay, I'm not sure where I ended off, sorry. But distract involves derailing the incident indirectly with the goal of getting the person experiencing harassment and violence out of the current situation. So this means interrupting the situation without directly mentioning or addressing the harassment that is occurring. And it is suggested that this is done by engaging the person experiencing harassment instead of the person doing the harassing. So, some examples using the story of Alex and Sam might include um, asking Sam to take a quick look at a document for you, or asking them to help you find the printer paper, or even dropping something and just redirecting the conversation entirely. So, the second possible intervention tactic is delegating. So, this involves asking another colleague to help intervene. And this could be a nearby coworker who seems ready and willing to help, or it could be an HR representative. It is important if you're choosing this tactic to be clear about the situation and the help you would like in that situation. So, some examples in the case of Alex and Sam could involve going to Oliver or Abby, your coworkers you're sitting with, and saying, I think Alex is making Sam uncomfortable. Can you go ask Alex to help you so I can see if Sam is okay? Or going to HR and saying, I saw Alex telling a sexual joke to Sam. I think you should talk to Sam and see if they want your help. So the third possible intervention tactic, according to the 5D model, is to document. So this involves taking detailed notes about an incident of harassment and violence with the goal of creating a factual record of the incident. So according to the 5D model, before deciding to document, a bystander should first make sure that the person experiencing harm has received or is receiving help. And if not, the 5D model suggests that bystanders should pick another action before documenting the incident. I think there should be more caveats to this as well, like considering whether it's actually safe for a person to intervene in a more direct way. Sometimes documenting the incident is the safest thing for the bystander to do. But once somebody does decide to document the incident, it should be as detailed as possible and include the date, location, the individuals involved, any witnesses, and if known, any actions that have already been taken by the employer. And the person who is experiencing the harassment should also be consulted and have the final decision regarding what they want to be done with your documentation. So in the case of Alex and Sam, this might look like Alex and Sam were talking in the break room over lunch at 12:15 p.m. on August 12th, 2025. Abby, Oliver, and I were also in the room at the next table. Alex told Sam a sexual joke about insert details, and Sam seemed uncomfortable. I wrote this note about the incident around 1 o'clock p.m. and then provided it to Sam and asked if they wanted my help taking any action. The fourth possible intervention tactic is to delay. So this tactic is recommended when it's not possible to intervene during an incident of harassment and violence.
It might be because it's not safe to do so, or the incident might have been very fleeting and you might not have had the opportunity to intervene. So in these cases, delaying is a useful strategy that involves waiting to take action until after the incident is over. When somebody uses this strategy, they check in with the person experiencing harassment and violence after the fact. This can help recognize the trauma of the situation and can help provide much needed support to survivors. So, in our example of Alex and Sam, this might be saying something like to Sam, I heard what Alex said to you at lunch and it was not acceptable. Are you okay? Do you want me to sit with you for a while? Or I heard what Alex said and I took notes. Do you want my record of the incident? I can go with you to HR if you'd like. So the fifth and final possible intervention tactic, according to the 5D model, is direct. So this involves naming the inappropriate behavior and confronting the person doing the harm in the moment. And this strategy should only be used with caution because it can be quite risky to do so. In the wrong situation, if you directly engage with the harasser, the person causing harm could redirect the behavior to the bystander, or they might even escalate the issue. So, before deciding to directly address harassment and violence in the moment, bystanders should assess their safety and that of the person being harmed and assess to the best of their ability what the person being harmed would want in that moment. So, some examples of intervening directly might include talking to Alex directly, saying, Alex, that joke is not appropriate, or Alex, that's harassment, or Alex, leave Sam alone. So now that we've discussed all five possible intervention tactics according to the 5D model, I'd like you to just take a moment and privately consider which of the 5Ds you'd be most likely to take in the situation of Alex and Sam. So would you choose to distract, delegate, document, delay, or be direct? So I'll just give you a minute to think about that while I just take a sip of water. Okay, so now that you hopefully thought about what you would do, now consider how someone's answer might change. If, for example, Alex was their friend, or they were really shy, or what if they're really tired, or maybe they're in a really bad mood? How would their response change because of those factors? So, current bystander training models including the 5D model we just talked about, predominantly assume that when someone witnesses harassment and violence, that they will intervene in some way. However, it doesn't quite work like this in reality. There are many individual, interpersonal, and contextual factors that influence how people behave in different situations. So together, these factors will influence whether someone will choose to intervene when they witness harassment and violence at work. And some of these factors, such as personality traits, are more stable, and we wouldn't expect training or other workplace practices to be able to change them. However, some factors can be addressed through workplace practices to increase the likelihood that someone will choose to intervene when they are a bystander. So first, let's start by talking about some individual factors that influence behavior. So individual traits and factors have a strong influence over the way people behave and the decisions that they make. As I mentioned, these things do tend to be relatively stable and they're not easily influenced by things like workplace training. So that means that if somebody has a strongly developed trait that impedes bystander intervention, there's little that workplace practices like training will do to actually influence that. Okay, so let's start with personality traits. So personality traits are stable or relatively stable characteristics that influence the way an individual thinks, feels, and behaves. So personality is very complex and many traits exist together. So it's not possible to perfectly predict how people will act in any given situation, but there are certainly patterns. So just a couple of examples of personality traits that would influence whether somebody decides to intervene as a bystander. One is altruism. So altruism is a selfless concern for others, often at the expense of one's own resources or well-being. So all things being equal, people who are highly altruistic are more likely to intervene when they see somebody who needs help. So, and then another factor to consider, another personality trait, is agreeableness, which can be described with words like cooperative, kind, and accommodating. And agreeableness has been strongly associated in general with pro-social behavior. Um, However, there's some context here as well, because although it is indeed associated with helping and pro-social behavior, agreeableness is also associated with avoidance of conflict. So, depending on the situation, highly agreeable people might actually behave in different ways. Sometimes they might be more likely to intervene, and other times they might be less likely to intervene. Another individual factor is sense of social responsibility. Um, so this is something that is influenced by personality, life experiences, and socialization. And people who have a strong sense of social responsibility are more likely to give help when it's needed. So they're more likely to intervene as a bystander. Another factor is mood. Mood is very variable, can change day to day, hour to hour, but it certainly affects helping behavior. So positive moods have been highly associated with more helping. Another factor that's been researched a lot is gender. So as a note, a lot of this research dates back to the 70s, and it was a very popular topic up to the 90s. So gender differences here, although they were very much so an interest to psychologists doing this work, it's this work has been very cis and heteronormative, and conceptualized gender as a binary of men and women. So more work really needs to be done on this topic that includes trans and non-binary folks as well. But gender has been a robust predictor in helping behavior, so I felt the need to address it here. But please note that my language here kind of reflects the limitations of the research. So in general, there aren't gender differences between uh, who helps more. So men and women have been found to help about equally, but they help in different situations. So these findings have been highly tied to traditional gender roles. But men are often thought to provide help in situations that require physical strength or demonstrate a heroic action of helping. Whereas women are often thought to provide help in situations that require long-term caring and emotional support. And again, this research has been very cis normative, and more work needs to be done to be more inclusive of all genders. Okay, so interpersonal factors also influence helping behavior and whether someone will intervene in instances of harassment and violence that they witness at work. So there are many of these, but a few examples would include relationships between people. So closer relationships between two people has been associated with more helping. So in the situation of Alex and Sam, if you're very close with Sam, you're more likely to intervene. And liking has also been associated with more helping. So you don't necessarily need to have a close relationship, but if you really like somebody, you're more likely to help as well. Another factor is the social identities of people involved. Um, so some considerations are whether the bystander is a member of a minority group or several minority groups. Um, if yes, there's a much greater risk of intervening, especially if they have intersecting identities that put them at greater risk for experiencing harassment and violence. Other things to consider are the social identities of the person experiencing harm and the person doing the harm. It's really important to consider the power differentials in the workplace, both in like a traditional work hierarchy of positions within jobs, but also recognizing that some people have greater social influence and power because of their identities. And people who have lower power within the workplace and within society are essentially at a higher risk for intervening. So they might choose not to because it's not safe for them. Okay. And then there are obviously many contextual factors more broadly that influence the way people behave. So, one example is social norms, which are the unwritten rules and expectations that guide how people behave within their social groups. And different social groups, such as friends, families, and colleagues, can and often do have different social norms. So, there's been a lot of research in social psychology on the power of normative social influence. Um, and even when the norms are clearly wrong, they still really influence behavior. So I'm just going to highlight one study quickly. It was a seminal study conducted in the 50s that showed groups of people two lines and asked them to identify which line was longer. And so each group went through this several times. Each group had six people, five of whom worked directly with the experimenter, and one person in each group was actually a participant in the study. So at the beginning, the five people who worked for the experimenter would give the correct answer of which line was longer. But then they slowly started to give obviously incorrect answers. And most of the time, the participant in the study would give the answer that matched the group, even when it was obviously wrong. And this study, it's very old, done in the 50s, as I said, but this study and many similar ones have been replicated time and time again that show the power of normative social influence in many areas of social behavior, including whether somebody will intervene as bystander. And as mentioned before, the workplace often has its own sets of norms, which can strongly influence the ways people behave. So, an important norm that will influence whether people intervene as bystanders when they witness harassment and violence at work is whether the workplace normalizes and accepts harassment and violence as part of the job. So, for example, consider a workplace that has a traditional boys' club environment where sexual jokes and making fun of people, especially those that don't fit in, is part of the day-to-day interaction. In those workplaces, people are less likely to report these forms of harassment and violence because they become so normalized within the workplace. And another important norm that will influence whether people intervene as bystanders is a history of action by the workplace. So, for example, if a workplace has consistent issues with harassment and violence, and people see that nothing is being done to address and prevent the issue, they will become less and less likely to report these incidents that they experience or witness. And unlike some of the individual and interpersonal factors that we've just discussed, contextual factors like these are often things that the workplace have at least some control over and can change to create safer workplaces that do not tolerate harassment and violence. So, remember that current bystander training models, including the 5D model we talked about, assumes that bystanders who witness harassment and violence will intervene. But we now know that that isn't necessarily true. There are many factors that will influence this decision. We've talked about individual differences, interpersonal factors, and contextual factors. And now we'll talk about the decision model of helping and some other factors, including knowledge, awareness, and perceptions that can influence the decision to intervene. So, the decision model of helping is a social psychological model that breaks down the pathway from witnessing harassment and violence to intervening into several actions and decisions, including noticing the event, interpreting the event as harassment and violence, assuming responsibility for helping, and knowing how to help. These steps are sequential and dependent on one another, meaning that if a person doesn't act on one step, the model stops regardless of any previous decisions made within the pathway. So now I'll talk about each step and how we can target the barriers within each to increase the likelihood of bystander intervention. So the first step is noticing the event. From a psychological perspective, a lot of unconscious processes occur for us to simply notice something around us. This is unconscious, much of it is unconscious, so we're often not explicitly aware of what's happening in our brains for us to simply perceive the world around us. However, this is the first step to deciding to intervene as a bystander. We must consciously notice the event before moving on to the next step of the decision model. So some barriers to noticing include loud environments, other sensory distractions, a self-focus or really strong focus on your work or what you're doing, and alcohol consumption, which can be a problem during things like work events or work travel. So if for any reason the event goes unnoticed, the bystander will not intervene. If, however, the event is consciously noticed, we move to the next decision in the model, which is interpreting the event as harassment and violence. So for this step to occur, the bystander needs to interpret what they've just witnessed as harassment and violence, and there are many factors that will influence this. So just some examples. The first is pluralistic ignorance, which happens when somebody believes that what they are thinking or what they believe is different from what most people are thinking or believing. And thus they conform to the perceived norm. So when witnessing harassment and violence, if nobody else around is reacting, you are more likely to think that you are overreacting and decide that what you've witnessed was in fact not harassment and violence. And if this happens, you are less likely to intervene. Another factor is whether people have knowledge of the continuum of violence and awareness of more, for lack of a better word, subtle forms of harassment and violence. So remember that harassment and violence tends to start with more subtle and covert behaviors, and recognizing those behaviors as harassment that occurs earlier in the continuum is important to recognizing harassment and violence when you see it. Another factor to interpreting the event is knowledge related to the relationships between people. So, for example, without background context, certain behaviors can seem innocuous, but they might actually be part of a broader pattern of harassment and violence. People can also be influenced by their own experiences with harassment and violence, including what they've seen at their current workplace and at other workplaces. So remember that if for any reason a bystander does not interpret the event as harassment and violence, the decision model of helping stops and the bystander will not intervene. So fortunately, there are some things that workplaces can do to increase the likelihood of people recognizing and interpreting harassment and violence as such. So for example, workplaces can provide education around the continuum of violence to increase knowledge about more subtle forms of harassment and violence. They can also increase training depth and frequency. So research on learning has shown that people are less likely to retain information long-term if they don't have refreshers on the content. And most workplaces, maybe I shouldn't say most, oftentimes workplaces do training as a one and done situation. So often when people are onboarding, they'll do their training for harassment and violence. And they don't really have often refreshers or conversations about this topic. But as I said, that's not the ideal way that people learn. So it would be very helpful if there were an increase in training access at different depths and frequencies. Workplaces can also increase access to this knowledge by, for example, offering lunch and learns, putting up informational posters, and ensuring that all policies and procedures surrounding harassment and violence are easily accessible by all workers. So if the bystander does interpret the event as harassment and violence, then we move to the next decision in the model, which is assuming responsibility. So for this step to occur, the bystander needs to assume responsibility for helping. And there are many factors that will influence this. So one example is diffusion of responsibility, which is the process by which responsibility to act is spread across a group of people. So if there are a lot of people witnessing harassment and violence, this is more likely to occur. So people are then less likely to offer help just because they assume another person will take that responsibility. You might have heard this talked about as the bystander effect. So the more people that are around, the less likely people are to receive help. That's the bystander effect. Another factor is the cost of helping. So there are many reasons why helping could just be too costly for an individual. So as I mentioned previously or alluded to previously, some people are at a higher risk for experiencing harassment and violence. If they are, for example, precariously employed or they are part of a marginalized group, they're more likely to experience harassment and violence themselves, so they may not want to intervene. It might be too costly for them to do that. There's also the fear of retaliation, which could include the harassment and violence being turned onto the bystander. Could also include fear of losing their job if they speak up. Another factor is the normative social influence, which we already talked about and know has a powerful influence on social behavior. So if the norm is that harassment and violence is allowed to happen and people don't take action, then bystanders are less likely to feel a personal responsibility to intervene. And if for any of these reasons or any other reason, a bystander does not assume responsibility to help, they will not intervene. Workplaces can increase the likelihood that people will assume this responsibility by making the costs of intervening as low as possible. So having multiple reporting avenues so that people can choose to report to a person that they feel safe with can reduce the cost of helping. Um, Also having clear policies on retaliation so that there are consequences for the person doing the harm if they retaliate against the bystander or the person making the report. But there will always be cases where it's not safe for people to intervene. But workplaces can do something to make it the costs a little bit lower for some people. They can also create a workplace culture where harassment and violence is unequivocally not accepted and demonstrating action when harassment and violence occurs at work and or is reported at work. So if the bystander has first noticed the event, interpreted it as harassment and violence, and assumed responsibility for helping, they move to the next step, which is knowing how to help. So oftentimes, even if people want to intervene, if they've made it through all those steps, they might not know how to help. So for example, they might not know who to go to or how to report or how to respond in the moment. And we know that if they don't know how to help, they won't intervene. So how do we increase the likelihood of knowing how to help? Workplaces should make information about how to report clear and easily accessible for all workers. They should also increase training on harassment and violence generally, which I've already alluded to. And they should implement bystander training like the 5D model, which teaches people how to respond in the moment. So as a reminder, this training asks the bystander to assess the situation and then choose to distract, delay, document, delegate, or directly intervene. And this can act as a guide for knowing how to provide help. So only once a bystander has gone through all of these steps, including noticing the event, interpreting the event as harassment and violence, assuming responsibility for intervening, and knowing how to help, can a bystander decide to intervene in the situation. There are still reasons, such as the individual differences, interpersonal factors, and contextual factors that we discussed that might mean a bystander who has gone through all of these steps will still choose not to intervene. But these steps are critical to getting to the decision-making phase. So reducing some of these barriers will get more people to the decision phase and hopefully improve the likelihood of intervention. So before we wrap up and get to the Q&A, I just want to highlight some key takeaways. Um, so there are many barriers to bystander intervention. It does not go quite as simply as if you witness harassment and violence that you will take an intervention action. There are many barriers, some of which can be addressed by the workplace. So increasing the frequency, depth, and breadth of training, making reporting structures clear and transparent, and normalizing responding to and addressing to harassment and violence will all help reduce some of these barriers to intervention. Um, and the goal should be to reduce these barriers so that people can progress through that decision model of helping and get to the point where intervention is actually possible. And training bystanders how to behave once they decide to intervene is certainly necessary. It helps reduce some of the barriers of knowing how to help. But in and of itself, it is not sufficient. We need to reduce these other barriers as well. So thank you all very much for listening, and I will turn it back to Christine, who will moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Alexa. That was amazing. Um, so we have a few questions, and folks, if you have any, please add them into the Q&A and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Um, so the first question is, Alexa, do you know of any in-person trainings around bystander intervention?
So the 5D model, it can be done in person. There are different organizations specifically that do offer this training. Um, the name of the one I'm thinking of is at the tip of my tongue. Um, I can't think of it, sorry. But yeah, there are organizations that do offer this training. Um, and I obviously it's regional dependent, so it depends
Yeah.
on where people are coming from, but certainly the bystander training is very popular, and I think not particularly difficult to access.
Many sexual assault centers actually offer bystander intervention training. So
Mhm.
it is very dependent on the community that you're in. But there are, like, if you reach out to your local sexual assault center, they would probably, if they can't provide it, they would probably be able to point you in the direction of someone locally who can.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so on the continuum of violence, where would you place microaggressions?
Microaggressions are such an interesting topic. How do I say this eloquently? To me, I feel like microaggressions is a little bit of a misnomer because to me, they really should just be called aggressions. Um, they are perhaps more subtle forms, but the ongoing and constant experience of them is extremely harmful. So one by itself is maybe you would maybe put it earlier in the continuum. But with microaggressions, the factor that is so harmful is that they are experienced constantly. So what I was mentioning earlier about knowing about the relationships between people, that can actually really be important for microaggressions. So if you only see one microaggression on off the cuff, and you don't know the relationship between people very well, and you don't know that maybe this is something that happens every single day, multiple times a day, you might think, oh, that's no big deal. But having that context is so important for recognizing just how harmful those aggressions can be. So I think. it's hard to place it on the continuum of violence in that way because for each individual instance might seem more subtle, but it's really the factor that's so important there is how constant that people experience those.
Yeah. So we do have a question around citations, and so folks are wondering if you could provide some of the citations that you used for this training so that they can dive deeper into the topic.
For sure. I guess a follow-up question that I'm not sure if it'll be able to be answered is if people are specifically interested in the like references related to the bystander training, or if they're interested in more of the social psychological processes as well,
Um,
or
let's
maybe just
see
all
if
of
we
it.
get a if you would like to answer that question, if you want to answer it in the Q&A, that would be great. Um, there's also a question around like how do you overcome othering in bystander intervention if liking or intersectionality can't be leveraged? It's a big question.
Yes, sorry, can you repeat the question?
So how do you overcome othering in bystander intervention if liking or intersectionality can't be leveraged?
That is a very big question.
It's so situation dependent, I think there's so many factors that go into every situation like this. And I'm guessing you'd want to think about like what types of intersectionality are we referring to and what are the social locations and identities of the people involved in that situation? Um,
for sure.
is that
Well,
risk?
just because somebody on paper has a certain like set of identities that makes them at greater risk, we still can't predict also with 100% accuracy that they won't intervene, right? Just because it's riskier to do so doesn't mean they won't. There are so many factors that go into that that it's really hard to, yeah, to have one answer, right? Because there are just so many factors that all work together. Um, yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, social behavior is incredibly context dependent. If you haven't gathered that from the talk, so yeah, it's I'm not sure how to answer that like in a like satisfying way in this moment. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that would depend. So someone else is asking if you have any information on what you would do if the person abusing people is the owner or boss.
Yeah, that's a very common uh it's a common problem and a common question. Um and it can depend. So if people are unionized in any type of way, you can consult with your union. I also recognize that that is a situation where it just can be incredibly difficult and not safe to intervene. And I just think everybody needs to assess their own safety in these moments. Um, if you feel like it would be safe to intervene and that person is the owner or the um yeah, the boss, then that's very different than if you wouldn't feel safe to intervene, right? Because sometimes it can depend on does the person doing the harm, in this case the owner, do they know what they're doing? If you think maybe not, maybe then it is safe for you to have that conversation, right? So it really comes down to needing to assess your own safety. There are, in terms of external resources, it's very dependent on where you work. But like I said, unions can help. If you have access to an EAP, employee assistance plan, often there are resources in there as well, including oftentimes including counseling. Um, but local sexual assault and sexual harassment centers often also can provide help in this format. They do often have quite long waiting lists, but there are community resources that could be available to help navigate your particular situation because, again, it's so context dependent. You can't just say, do this or do that, right? Because it might not make sense in a given situation.
Thank you, Alexa. I'm to the folks that we didn't get to answering your questions, I'm so sorry. We're running out of time. But if you want to email them to us at nff@uwo.ca, then we can try to answer any questions that you have that you would like answers to. Um, and so there are also a number of resources. If you check out the Respect at Work website, there are trainings around harassment and violence at work, and a lot of resources, infographics that are very helpful. So yeah, check out their website, which is it's not part of the job.ca.
Yes.
Um, and then, yeah, if you have any follow-ups, please reach out to us. We would be happy to answer. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your time and engagement, and a special thanks to Alexa for sharing your insights on this very important topic. The session was recorded and it will be available to you via the Neighbors, Friends, and Families website and our YouTube page. Please don't forget to fill out the feedback survey that will automatically open when this window closes. And that brings us to the end of our online learning session. Thanks again, and we hope to connect with you again soon. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.